There is a handout being passed around. I don't think I have enough copies, so if some of you can share a copy, that would be very helpful. And typically, I probably won't usually refer to when I'm somewhere on the handout, but it's pretty much, I mean, it is in the order of how I'm going to do things. And I will say, as I get to each new section, I will announce that, but I probably won't stop and say, this is on your handout. You can just keep up with that. Okay, one more piece of housekeeping here. Okay. This is entitled, I Believe, Help My Unbelief, a passage that Megan alluded to the other night, and is one of the ones that I think is kind of in the back of the minds of a lot of what a lot of us here are doing. Subtitled, Faith, Hope, and Doxastic Voluntarism. In his essay, Faith Without Belief, Louis Pojman argues that belief is not the only mental attitude that can undergird the kind of faith required for Christianity. That any mental attitude toward the claims of Jesus that motivates us to accept, adopt, and live by them is sufficient, all other things being equal, to make us people of faith. Pojman argues that the attitude of hope may function in place of belief. The authenticity of Pojman's basic idea was driven home to me one day by the man that I consider to be the greatest living American storyteller, Garrison Keillor. One night on Prairie Home Companion, Garrison Keillor and some of his musicians were singing the great old gospel song, Farther Along. And after the song, Keillor wistfully reflected on the comforting first line of the song's chorus. Farther along, we'll know all about it. And then he said this, in that marvelous, inimitable Garrison Keillor voice. He said, "Oh, I hope it's true. I hope it's true." Well, I sat stunned, staring at the radio, because here I realized was the emotional power of Pojman's highly analytical, highly academic essay. Keillor's longing rumination can be taken naturally and unequivocally as a statement of faith, even though it's an assertion of hope, not of belief. So yes, I'm another one of that we don't need no stinking beliefs crowd. We feel in Keillor's words the kind of motivation necessary to call a person to the kind of life that Jesus requires. Before going on, though, it's important for me to be clear about exactly what I am and am not saying about the role that hope can play in faith. I'm not claiming any logical relationship between faith and hope. I do not claim that hope is either necessary or sufficient for faith. It's perfectly possible for each to exist without the other. What I am claiming is that hope can be, but it doesn't have to be, constitutive of faith. Christian faith requires some cognitive element, some positive propositional attitude toward the essential claims of Christianity. That may be the most oft-repeated phrase of this conference, by the way, positive propositional attitude. That's what's needed. Traditionally, that positive attitude has been understood to be belief of a certain kind. I do not argue that belief cannot play the required cognitive role. Indeed, I believe it can and most often does play that role. Furthermore, as you'll see, I believe that faith is the most desirable of possible propositional attitudes for faith. What I'm arguing is that belief need not play that role. That while belief can be and usually is constitutive of faith, it's not necessary for faith. What is necessary for faith is that there be a positive propositional attitude, not that it be a particular species of a propositional attitude. Hope, I argue, is a viable candidate for the mandatory propositional attitude. Hence, I claim that hope, like belief, can be constitutive of Christian faith. A rough and ready way, I think, to think of my claim is something like this, and this is very rough, but I think it's a good first approximation. For any case of faith in which belief is the required positive propositional attitude, hope could be substituted for belief in the same situation, and the result would still be a case of faith. So you take the belief out, put in hope, you've still got faith. That is definitely rough and needs some serious refinement, but that'll get us going. Okay, second section then, hope-based faith and doxastic voluntarism. But why should faith be based on hope rather than belief? Why can't people of faith simply be believers? What circumstances would make it necessary or desirable to take the circuitous route through hope? To answer this question, I first have to address the issue that has been addressed several times already of doxastic voluntarism. And for the sake of parsimony, I'll simply refer to this view as voluntarism. Voluntarism is the view that our beliefs, like our actions, are under our willful control. According to voluntarism, we can choose to believe or disbelieve a given claim, just like we can choose to do or not do a given action. Pojman uses the phrase volitionalism to refer to this concept. In this simplest form, doxastic voluntarism, I think anyway, is obviously false. We'll consider a more sophisticated form momentarily. But our beliefs, it seems, are not the kinds of things we can simply choose to have or to surrender. You could not decide right now to believe that New York City is the capital of the United States. I could not right now choose to believe that or to choose to stop believing that I teach college. My belief about what I do for a living is what it is because my experience is what it is. And my background beliefs are what they are. And I have no voluntary control over any of that. It is a myth that we overtly choose by an act of will to believe or disbelieve anything in normal circumstances. So consider Carol, who is trying to decide whether or not the gospel is true. I learned that from Dan Howard Snyder. Decide. She considers the evidence for or against. She listens to the arguments, reads the books, meditates on the data. Along the way, she finds herself very greatly attracted to the ideas and ideals of the gospel. She finds the moral teachings of Jesus very appealing, the message of salvation, healing, and eternal bliss extremely attractive. However, none of this carries evidential weight for her. She finds herself thinking, it sure would be great if this was true. I would love for things really to be like this. I sure hope it's true. Nonetheless, try though she might, she can't come to the conclusion that it is true. In such a situation, Carol cannot simply choose to believe. Her beliefs are what they are because her experiences and background beliefs are what they are. Her consideration of the evidence is what it is, and she cannot change any of that. What she knows about the gospel does not bring her to believe, but it does bring her to hope. Now, William James introduced the notion of faith as a forced option. We must either live in obedience to the gospel or in disobedience to it. There's no middle ground. There's no such thing as behaving like an agnostic. The agnostic must either obey or disobey. Agnostics typically respond with disobedience, acting as if the gospel were false, and thus become sort of atheists by default. But this reaction is not necessary. It is conceivable that an agnostic should choose instead to behave as if the gospel were true, even though she does not believe that it is. And why wouldn't Carol, in her position, choose to do precisely that? Her non-cognitive responses incline her in that direction. She delights in the idea that the gospel may be true, wishes that it could be, hopes that it is. Those are not non-cognitive, so I used the wrong word there, but you get the idea. Non-doxastic, how about that? Her non-doxastic responses. She must either act as if it is true or as if it isn't. Why shouldn't she, why wouldn't she, in this situation, choose the former path? And notice, by the way, that she's not being hypocritical in doing this. She does not believe the gospel is false. She simply does not believe one way or the other. But as James points out, she must act one way or the other. Whichever way she chooses, she will be acting as if. Now, suppose she does indeed choose the as if it is true routine. She lives among the Christian community in obedience to the commands of Christ. She prays regularly, hoping dearly that someone is listening. She talks as if it's all true, choosing to look at events as if they are unfolding according to God's plans. And all of this because of a sincere and heartfelt desire that these things be true. In such a situation, her life is not going to look any different from the life of a person who genuinely believes and acts according to those beliefs. If her beliefs are not under her control, and they will not on their own come around to a state of belief, she will not on her own come around to a state of belief, then this living as if, motivated by hope, will be the best she can do. So section 3 on beliefs and emotions. There's an analogy to emotions that I think can clarify my point. I think it's probably more obvious to most people that our emotions are not under our direct control than it is that our beliefs are not under our direct control. We cannot feel emotions on demand. If someone says to you, be angry, no matter how much you might wish to oblige, you cannot simply feel anger on cue. We realize this acutely in those really annoying times when we're in a bad mood or a blue funk, and invariably someone, our spouse or our friend or a parent, comes up and says, oh, come on, cheer up. Snap out of it. You know, my response is always, why didn't I think of that? Oh, gosh. You know, usually there's nothing we'd like better than to snap out of it. However, we know that we can't simply decide to cheer up. Our emotions are not at our beck and call. They're natural, involuntary responses to outside stimuli. Events occur that we like or don't like, approve of or eschew, delight in or mourn over, and we find ourselves feeling a certain way as a natural, uncontrollable result. In the same way, our beliefs are, for the most part anyway, involuntary responses to outside stimuli, probably for all the part, but we'll say at least for the most part. We are exposed to evidence that inclines us toward belief or rejection, that makes a claim seem more or less likely, that persuades or dissuades us, and as a result we find ourselves believing a certain way, either accepting, rejecting, or withholding judgment. Now let's think about emotions a little more deeply. Given that emotions are not under our control, does it not seem odd that there are numerous passages in Scripture that seem to command us to feel certain emotions? Consider Philippians 4:4. Rejoice in the Lord always. I say it again, rejoice. Just 2 verses later we read, do not be anxious for anything. And in Ephesians 4:26, Paul charges, do not let the sun go down when you are still angry. Well, what's going on here? I mean, God is God, right? That much we can take for granted. And surely God knows that we cannot routinely turn emotions on and off like tap water. Furthermore, I'm sure that God knows that it does no good to command someone concerning things over which he has no control. So why in the world would God give us such a long list of seemingly emotion-based commands? Well, to find the answer, let's consider what is undoubtedly the largest collection of apparently emotional commands in the New Testament, the many commands we are given to love each other. Many preachers and Bible teachers are quick to point out, and rightly so, that these are not commands to feel warm and fuzzy over each other. They are commands to behave toward one another in active goodwill. That's the way my seminary professor put it. To act to meet the genuine needs of those in our care. The biblical concept of love, of agape love, is a volitional concept, not an emotional concept. And that makes the commands legitimate. After all, we may not have control over how we feel, but we certainly do have control over, most of the time anyway, over how we behave. So it may only make sense that a command seemingly directing us to feel a certain way is in fact simply commanding us to behave a certain way. I've heard that before today. Okay, and this is precisely the way to think about all of the apparently emotion-based commands in the Bible. None of them are commands to feel a certain way. They are all commands to behave, commands to exercise control in that one area of our lives where we routinely have genuine control. In fact, when we look at the textual context of these commands, we almost always find explicit behavioral commands that constitute instructions on how to obey the seemingly emotional commands. In the Philippians 4 passages, commanding us to rejoice and not be anxious, they're accompanied by explanatory commands. Let your gentleness be evident to all. And by prayer and petition with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. That's how we don't be anxious. That's how we rejoice. Now, if belief is no more voluntary than emotion, then it stands to reason that apparently cognitive commands in the Scripture must be thought about in the same way that apparently emotional commands are. They must be thought of primarily as commands to action. After all, it is our volition that is most readily and genuinely under our control. So consider 1 John 3:23, where we are told explicitly, this is his command, to believe in the name of his Son, Jesus Christ. This passage is followed immediately by two clarifying addenda. First is a second parallel command, and to love one another. The apparent cognitive command, believe in his name, is followed by an apparently emotional one, love one another. We know the latter command is volitional, not emotional, so it seems that John is inviting us to recognize the former command as likewise volitional, not cognitive, or not doxastic. Then, just in case we're too dense to pick up on this subtlety, John adds in verse 24, those who obey his commands live in him and he in them. How do we believe in the name of Jesus? How do we love one another? By obeying Christ's commands. It would be nice, perhaps even preferable, if that obedience could be commanded by genuine, unwavering intellectual assent and genuine, heartfelt warmth of sentiment for our brothers and sisters. But whether or not that comes along is not always up to us. And it's not what is central. We believe and we love by obeying. And this brings us full circle back to Pojman's main point. The normal, expected, common reason one would choose to obey is because one really does believe. This is typical, but not necessary. One who cannot, despite careful consideration of the case of Christianity, bring himself to believe, may nonetheless hope or desire that it be true. If that person furthermore understands that he can only act as if true or as if it is false, there's no middle ground, then it would be perfectly understandable, indeed rational, for that person to choose to behave in accordance with what he hopes to be true, rather than what he hopes is false. And in so doing, that person would be fulfilling 1 John 3:23. He would be a person of faith, but faith without belief. So section 4, indirect voluntarism and the ethics of belief. At this point, we must consider a major objection to the previous section. The objection is that doxastic voluntarism is not totally false. There's a very important sense in which it's true. Philosophers distinguish between direct and indirect voluntarism. Direct voluntarism is the position we've been discussing, the view that we can simply choose to believe or disbelieve the same way we can choose to act or not act. This view, I think, is very clearly false. But indirect voluntarism is the view that we do have control over certain things that will in turn influence what we believe. In other words, while we cannot directly control or choose what we will believe, we can choose to a certain extent anyway, what will shape our beliefs. And again, there's an analogy to the way emotions work. I may not be able to, if I'm feeling down, I may not be able to just suddenly decide to cheer up, but I can get out of the house, I can go hang out with friends, I can go do something fun. And so if I don't do that and I remain in a bad mood, my wife is justified in blaming me for being in a bad mood. I may not be able to choose to overcome the mood directly, but I could choose to do things that will probably help me overcome it. And if I don't choose that, then I'm to blame for the mood I have. No problem. So this seems to be true as well for indirect doxastic voluntarism. There are many choices I can make, what I read, to whom I talk, etc., that will have a great deal of influence on what I wind up believing. So while it may be true that Carol cannot simply choose to believe the gospel, it's also true that there are many choices she could make that would make it much more likely that she could come to believe it. She could immerse herself in the Christian subculture or read only the finest Christian apologetic literature. Since these choices are open to the one who wishes to believe, it seems that she could make such choices in order to engender belief, rather than settling for the substandard attitude of hope and trying to build her faith on that. Let's call this the indirect voluntarism objection. There's no ultimate problem with the notion of faith requiring belief because, although we cannot directly choose to believe, we can directly choose to act in ways that will bring us to believe. The indirect voluntarism objection is not as strong as it might initially appear. In the first place, while it's true that we can make some choices as to what will and won't influence our beliefs, there's no choices that will guarantee that a person who wants to believe in Jesus will come to do so. There are several reasons why this is true, but the most obvious one is that we do not have control over all the things that affect our beliefs. As long as there are dimensions of our experience that influence our beliefs and that are outside of our control, then there is always the possibility, and for many people perhaps the likelihood, that none of those choices they do have will result in coming to believe. So there could be people who do everything they can to influence themselves toward belief, but still fail. Now here I'm going to skip a section that's really a fun section, but for the sake of time, where I deal with what I call the ethics of belief response. It's actually a criticism of the indirect voluntarism objection, and I present it, but then I reject it. I don't think it works. I think indirect voluntarism stands up against that complaint, but I have this other thing that allows me to reject it, that it won't guarantee. Okay, so section 5, hope-based faith, a closer look. In order to get a full grasp on the idea that faith may be grounded in hope rather than belief, it's important to think a little more deeply about what it means to hope that the gospel is true. Pojman makes several very helpful observations about the nature of hope that can help us out here. First of all, we must realize that hope is not simply about the future. We often talk about hope in terms of our desire and anticipation for some future event, but it also makes perfectly good sense to talk about hoping now that something happened in the past. If I see you the day after an algebra exam and I ask you, did you pass the test? You could legitimately say, well, I don't know yet, but I sure hope so. We can also hope that certain facts are true when there's no time in focus at all. If 1/3 of the points on your algebra exam came from a single problem for which you utilize the quadratic formula, you can say, I sure hope that's the right formula for that problem. If it is the right formula, then it always has been the right formula, and always will be. Time's not a factor here at all, but you can still hope it's the right formula. All of these senses of hope are utilized in hope-based faith. I certainly hope that events in the future will occur, God's providential care, guidance for my life, the return of Jesus, my entrance into heaven, etc. I also hope that events in the past have occurred, the sacrificial death of Jesus, his resurrection, etc. Most of all, I hope that certain timeless truths obtain, that the theistic God exists, that Jesus is his son, etc. So the concept of hope is especially suited to faith since it is able to cover all of the temporal dimensions of faith. Hope entails, or applies to past, present, and future. Hope entails possibility. One cannot hope, I cannot hope that I pass the algebra test if I know that I left half the questions blank and you have to have more than 50% to pass the test. We cannot hope for what we unshakably believe to be impossible. The one whose faith is hope-based may not be convinced that the gospel is true, but she must be convinced that it might be true. In other words, the propositional attitude that she has is something like this: for all I know, it's true. Or maybe it's true, maybe it's not, who knows. Only with this concession can one then consistently say, and I sure hope it's true. This fact about hope is one of the things that makes it possible for hope to ground faith. Faith requires the kind of commitment that will motivate obedient behavior, even in the face of powerful external motivations not to do so. Such commitment seems possible without belief so long as one is able to cling to the possibility that the gospel is true. That is, the realization that it might be true, together with the sincere desire and hope that it is true, may well conjure up enough motivational power to incite belief. Or to incite obedience, excuse me. However, if that desire that it be true is counterbalanced by a firm commitment that it can't possibly be true, it's hard to see how the motivation for obedience could ever be forthcoming. Hope also entails uncertainty. In other words, we cannot hope for that which we are already convinced is true. This is impossible for the simple reason there's no role for hope to play in this situation. It's the very nature of hope to supply a positive attitude toward a claim in the absence of belief. So hope is inconsistent with both extremes, with firm denial and with firm assent. We can only hope for that of which we are uncertain, both of its truth and of its falsehood. Again, the doxastic attitude of the hoper is something like, maybe it's true, maybe it isn't, who knows. And in this dimension of hope, it is this dimension of hope that makes hope-based faith always inferior and secondary to belief-based faith, however helpful it may be. It is imperative on the one with faith grounded only in hope to be doing whatever she can legitimately do to cultivate the development of belief, just as it's imperative on those who already believe to do what they can legitimately do to strengthen and protect that belief. One reason for this is precisely because belief holds much more promise for sustaining our faith, I think, than when our obedience comes with a price. But it's still more likely that belief will do so, and do so much more efficiently. Hope may well, let me read this sentence, guys. Hope may well carry us through when the obedience comes with a price, but it's much more likely that belief will do so, and do so much more efficiently. And here I'm going to skip a section where I emphasize that hope entails a certain kind of desire. The hoper wants the claim in question to be true. It's this point where I have some concerns for positions of certain compatriots in this camp. I'm not sure how accounts such as acceptance or assumption can incorporate this desire that I see to be an important element of the motivational role that hope plays. Dan and I were talking about this at lunch. Trust can probably do that. So section 6, hope-based faith and the volatility of the emotions. In this section, we'll consider an important objection to the entire concept of hope-based faith, namely that hope is an emotion and it's improper and dangerous to base faith on any emotion. There are 3 parts to this objection. 1, that hope is an emotion. 2, that basing faith on emotions is improper. And 3, that basing faith on emotions is dangerous. I want to address these concerns in reverse order. The charge that basing faith on emotions is dangerous stems primarily, I think, from the realization that emotions are so changeable. Feelings that we have one day may well be gone the next. If our commitment to obeying the gospel is based on such feelings, it will come and go with those feelings. We've already noted that emotions are involuntary. We do not simply choose to have them or rid ourselves of them. Emotions are natural responses to things that happen to us. Therefore, the emotions we feel are often outside of our control. The danger in basing our faith on emotions is precisely here. As our emotions ebb and flow, the warning goes, so will our faith grounded in them. But here we must remember an important and perhaps disturbing point. We have seen that beliefs are involuntary as well. They may also change due to circumstances outside our control. Why do we see belief-based faith to be more secure or invulnerable than emotion-based faith? I agree that it is. One reason might be that while beliefs are indeed changeable, they don't seem nearly as changeable, nearly as susceptible to the kinds of daily swings that our emotions sometimes display. Why should that be the case? If both emotions and beliefs are voluntary, why should it be that the latter are less fickle than the former? Well, the reason I think is that beliefs are invariably intentional. They are beliefs about something. They are beliefs that a given claim is true. And if they are well grounded, they are based on reasons. In order for the belief to be changed, it's not enough simply for time to pass or outside stimuli to alter. One must be convinced that the reasons she once thought supported the belief are no longer persuasive. That's what it takes to change a belief. And it's far more difficult and less likely for such a situation to develop than for the external kinds of circumstances that engender emotions to shift radically. So there's some initial merit to the idea that while beliefs and emotions are both involuntary, a faith based in the former will be much more stable. But as we've seen, the kind of hope that creates faith is likewise grounded in reasons. The only difference is that the reasons for belief-based faith are understood to be more convincing or of a different quality than the reasons for hope-based faith. This, of course, makes hope-based faith a bit more slippery and vulnerable, but it also distinguishes this hope qualitatively from the kind of emotions that swing back and forth, literally with changes in the weather or the fortunes of a favorite sports team. This point brings to light an important distinction we need to make explicit, the difference between cognitive emotions and non-cognitive emotions. The former are emotions, like the hope that grounds faith, that gain at least some of their impetus from the consideration of content, of claims believed to be true, of arguments, of reasoning. Hope that grounds faith is this kind. If it is an emotion, it's this kind of emotion. We might also call these content emotions. If I'm excited over the University of Nebraska's chances of winning the Women's National Volleyball Championship, that excitement will typically be created in part by my belief that they stand a better than negligible prospect of doing so. And as such, the excitement is not likely to wane significantly or quickly unless I become convinced that such probability does not obtain after all. So, skip ahead. Even if hope is an emotion, it's not the kind of emotion that changes quickly with the weather. It's right in there with belief in terms of being grounded in reasons. And then finally, I'm going to skip the section. Well, let me read this. The second charge in the objection that we're considering is that basing faith in emotion is improper. One reason for thinking so is that it is dangerous and places our faith at unnecessary risk, but we've just neutralized the charge that hope-based faith is dangerous, so we need not worry about this tack. The only other reason that there might be for the charge of impropriety is that we should only ground faith and the conviction and obedience it entails in something that we believe. If we did not believe but act as if we do, then we're being disingenuous, hypocritical, or dishonest. But we've already dealt with that approach in section 2. Faith is a forced option. We must respond to the gospel either as believers or as unbelievers. There's no such thing as having the convictions or the behavior patterns of an agnostic. Okay, thank you. The person who would base her faith in hope is a person who neither believes that the gospel is true nor believes that it's false, but she must act one way or the other. Okay, so I'm going to skip my response to the claim that hope is an emotion at all. I argue that it's more proper to think of it as a kind of cognitive hope, the kind of cognitive hope I have in mind. I argue that it's more proper to think of the kind of cognitive hope I have in mind simply as a propositional attitude, not as an emotion at all. But of course, if one insists on calling it emotion, then we recognize it as one of these content emotions rather than just a mood that changes literally with the weather. So that is essentially the substance part of the paper. I come to section 7, which is the preaching part of the paper. I want to conclude with a Bible study of sorts. The concept of hope-based faith has helped shed light for me on one of the most puzzling passages in the Gospels. And in so doing, it's turned it into one of my favorite passages. My favorite passage is the healing of the blind man in John chapter 8, but I love this too. At the foot of the Mount of Transfiguration in Mark 9, Jesus is confronted by a demon-possessed boy and his father looking for healing. When Jesus tells the boy's father that everything is possible for those who believe, the man replies, "I believe. Help my unbelief." The statement sounds contradictory, but of course it's rhetorical and is using the contrast between belief and unbelief to make a dramatic point. But what point? Many contemporary translations try to find that point by clearing up the verbal conflict. So the New Living Translation says, "I do believe, but help me not to doubt." The New Century Bible says, "I believe, help me to believe more." And the Good News Bible reads, "I do have faith, but not enough. Help me to have more." I don't like any of these translations. And I have 2 Bible college degrees, so I can have an opinion like that. I don't like them for 2 reasons. One existential and the other exegetical. The existential reason is this: none of these translations sounds desperate enough. This is a desperate man in a desperate situation. He feels at one and the same time that he's doing everything he possibly can for his son and that he's not doing nearly enough. He's at his wit's end and doesn't have the slightest idea where to go from here. When Jesus tells him, somewhat cavalierly I always thought, anything's possible for someone who believes, the man's nerves snap. He thinks, believe? Believe? If I didn't believe, what would I be doing here? Why would I subject myself and my son to this kind of public embarrassment? If you don't remember the weird situations, go back and read Mark 9. It was a bizarre situation. And so he declares to Jesus, "I do believe." But in the next instant, his mind races on. Wait, do I believe? Don't I often feel like I've just given up? Don't I often feel like Mother Teresa? Don't I frequently wonder whether any of this does any good? Am I not always ready at a moment's notice to just pack it in and live with the horror? And now even Jesus' disciples haven't been able to help. So confronted with the spinning confusion that is his daily struggle with his faith, he begs Jesus out of his deep anxiety, help my unbelief. The man is anything but lucid. He's anything but rational. The last thing he's going to say is something that makes perfectly good sense about the natural interplay between belief and doubt. He's torn to his very soul and in the end has no real idea what he believes. So he throws himself at Jesus' mercy. And the verbal outcome of this raging battle is literal gibberish. I believe. I don't believe. I've got what it takes. I need your help. And when a Bible translation takes all of that real-life human bewilderment and dissolves it with a clear, coherent, understandable rendering, I sense that something essential in the text has been violently removed. My exegetical objection to this translation is really quite simple. The tension of the translation, I believe, help my unbelief, is reflective of a tension present in the original text. The words Mark wrote are words of conflict, words of confusion, paradoxical words. I believe that honest exegesis, of which good translation is the first step, requires us to preserve in our translation what is present in the original. For example, if a text is genuinely ambiguous in the original language, a good translation will find a way to preserve that ambiguity in the translation in the receptor language. The tension in this text is rock bottom and fundamental. We do the church a disservice if we translate it in a way that hides, removes, or resolves that tension. I got about 3 more paragraphs. And this is where my essay comes in. From a religious standpoint, the word belief can have 2 different connotations. The first is primarily cognitive. Belief is mental assent to the truth of the claims of a given religion. The second is primarily volitional. Belief is commitment to behave in accordance with the demands of that religion. These often go hand in hand, but not necessarily. The demons who believe and tremble in James 2:19 have the mental assent, but not the volitional commitment. And I believe the man in Mark 9 is, to a certain extent, an example of the opposite situation. He's willing and ready to do whatever God wants him to do, but he's losing the power to affirm that God will indeed come through for him. Nonetheless, the man stands before Jesus in an act of faith. So obviously the volitional dimension is making some headway. But then the words of Jesus remind him of his persistent indecisiveness, and he fears that his lack of wholehearted assent has cost him his chance to save his son. He cannot in that moment will himself to affirmation. All he can do is cry out for Jesus' help. But what motivates the cry? It's not the man's firm belief. That's precisely what's in question. The man cries out because he hopes, desperately hopes, that his pitiful petition will be honored.